Chapter 25. A Little Child Shall Lead. After dinner, Harold went back to his cabin, locking himself in. He lay down on the sofa. The gloom of his great sorrow was heavy on him. The reaction from the excitement of the morning had come. He was recalled to himself by a gentle tapping. Unlocking the opening to the door, he saw Mr. Stonehouse, who said with trouble in his voice, "I came to you on account of my little child." There he stopped with a break in his voice. Harold, with intent to set his mind at ease and to stave off further expressions of gratitude, replied, "Oh, pray don't say anything. I am only too glad that I was privileged to be of service. I only trust that the dear little girl is no worse for her adventure. That is why I'm here," said the father quickly. "My wife and I are loath to trouble you, but the poor little thing has worked herself into a paroxysm of fright and is calling for you. We have tried in vain to comfort or reassure her, but she will not be satisfied without you. She keeps calling on the man to come and help her. I am loath to put you to further strain after all you have gone through today. But if you would come—" Harold was already in the passage as he spoke. "Of course I'm coming. If I can in any way help, it is both a pleasure and a duty to be with her." Turning to the father, he added, "She is indeed a very sweet and good child. I shall never forget how she bore herself whilst we waited for the aid to come." "You must tell her mother and me all about it," said the father, much moved. When they came close to the Stonehouse's suite of rooms, they heard Pearl's voice rising with a pitiful note of fear. "Where is the man? Oh, where is the man? Why doesn't he come to me? He can save me. I want to be with the man." When the door opened and she saw him, she gave a shriek of delight, and, springing from the arms of her mother, fairly leaped into Harold's arms, which were outstretched to receive her. She clung to him and kissed him again and again, rubbing her little hands all over his face, as though to prove to herself that he was real and not a dream. Then, with a sigh, she laid her head on his breast, the reaction of sleep coming all at once to her. With a gesture of silence, Harold sat down, holding the child in his arms. Her mother laid a thick shawl over and sat down close to Harold. Mr. Stonehouse stood quiet in the doorway, with the child's nurse peering anxiously over his shoulder. After a little while, when he thought she was asleep, Harold rose and began to place her gently in the bunk. But the moment he did so, she waked with a scream. The fright in her eyes was terrible. She clung to him, moaning and crying out between her sobs, "Don't leave me! Don't leave me! Don't leave me!" Harold was much moved and held the little thing tight in his strong arms, saying to her, "No, darling, I shan't leave you. Look in my eyes, dear one. I will promise you, and then you will be happy, won't you?" She looked quickly up at his face. Then she kissed him lovingly and rested her head, but not sleepingly this time, on his breast, said, "Yes, I'm not afraid now. I'm going to stay with the man." Presently, Mrs. Stonehouse, who had been thinking of ways and means, and of the comfort of the strange man who had been so good to her child, said, "You asleep with mother tonight, darling? Mr. the man—" She said this with an appealing look of apology to Harold. "The man will stay with you till you are asleep. But she interrupted, not fretfully or argumentatively, but with a settled air of content. "No, I'm going to sleep with the man." "But, dear one," the mother expostulated, "the man will want to sleep too." "All right, mother. He can sleep too. I'll be very good and lie quite quiet. But oh, mother, I can't sleep unless his arms are around me. I'm afraid if they're not, the sea will get me." And she clung closer to Harold, tightening her arms round his neck. "You will not mind?" asked Mrs. Stonehouse timidly to Harold, and seeing acquiescence in his face, added in a burst of tearful gratitude, "Oh, you are good to her, to us all." "Hush," Harold said quietly. Then he said to Pearl, in a cheerful, matter-of-fact way which carried conviction to the child's mind, "Now, darling, it is time for all good little girls to be asleep, especially when they have had an interesting day. You wait here till I put my pyjamas on, and then I'll come back for you, and Mother and Father shall come and see you nicely tucked in." "Don't be long," the child anxiously called after him as he hurried away. Even trust can have its doubts. In a few minutes, Harold was back in pyjamas and slipper and dressing gown. Pearl, already wrapped in a warm shawl by her mother, held out her arms to Harold, who lifted her. The Stonehouse's suite of rooms was close to the top of the companion-way, and as Harold's stateroom was on the saloon deck, the little procession had, much to the man's concern, run the gauntlet of the throng of passengers whom the bad weather had kept indoors. When he came out of the day cabin, carrying the child, there was a rush of all the women to make much of the little girl. They were all very kind and not troublesome. Their interest was natural enough, and Harold's stopped whilst they petted the little thing. The little procession followed, Mr. and Mrs. Stonehouse coming next, and last the nurse, who manifested a phase of the anxiety of a hen who sees her foster ducklings wading towards a pond. When Harold was in his bunk, the little maid was brought in. When they had all gone, and the cabin was dark, save for the gleam from the night-light which the careful mother had placed out of sight in a basin at the foot of the bunk, Harold lay a long time in a negative state, if such be possible, in so far as thought was concerned. Presently he became conscious of a movement of the child in his arms, a shuddering movement, and a sort of smothered groan. The little thing was living over again, in sleep, the perils and fears of the day. Instinctively she put up her hands and felt around her, then with a sigh clasped her arms round his neck, and with a peaceful look laid her head upon his breast. Even through the gates of sleep, her instinct had recognized and realized protection. And then this trust of a little child brought back the man to his nobler self. Once again came back to him that love which he had, and which he knew now that he had never lost, for the little child that he had seen grow into full womanhood, whose image must dwell in his heart of hearts for evermore. The long night's sleep quite restored Pearl. She woke fairly early and without any reoccurrence of fear. At first she lay still, fearing she would wake the man, but finding that he was awake, he had not slept a wink all night, she kissed him and then scrambled out of bed. It was still early morning, but early hours rule on shipland. Harold rang for the steward, and when the man came, he told him to tell Mr. Stonehouse that the child was awake. His delight, when he found the child unfrightened looking out of the port, was unbounded. Chapter 26. A Noble Offer. That day Harold passed in unutterable gloom. The reaction was strong on him, and all his woe, his bitter remembrance of the past, and his desolation for the future were with him unceasingly. In the dusk of the evening, he wandered out to his favourite spot, the cable tank, on top of the aft wheelhouse. Here he had been all alone, and his loneliness had the added advantage that from the isolated elevation he could see if anyone approached. He had been out there during the day, and the captain, who had noticed his habit, had rigged up a canvas dodger on the rail on the weather side. When he sat down on the coiled hawsers in the tank, he was both secluded and sheltered. In this peaceful corner, his thoughts ran freely and in sympathy with the turmoil of wind and wave. How unfair it was! Why had he been singled out for such misery? What gleam of hope or comfort was left to his miserable life since he had heard the words of Stephen, those dreadful words which had shattered in an instant all the cherished hopes of his life? Too well he remembered the tone and look of scorn with which the horrible truths had been conveyed to him. In his innermost soul he had accepted them as truths. Stephen's soul had framed them, and Stephen's lips had sent them forth. From his position behind the screen, he did not see the approaching figure of Mr. Stonehouse, and was astonished when he saw his head rise above the edge of the tank as he climbed the straight Jacob's ladder behind the wheelhouse. The elder man paused as he saw him and said, in an apologetic way, "Will you forgive my intruding on your privacy? I wanted to speak to you alone, and as I saw you come up here a while ago, I thought it would be a good opportunity." Harold was rising as he spoke. "By all means. This place is common property, but all the same I am honoured in your seeking me." The poor fellow wished to be genial, but despite his efforts, there was a strange formality in the expression of his words. The elder man understood and said as he hurried forward and sank beside him, "Pray don't stir. Why, what a cosy corner this is! I don't believe at the moment there is such a peace in the ship." Once again the bitterness of Harold's heart broke out in sudden words. "I hope not. There is no soul on board to whom I would wish such evil," the old man said as he laid his hand softly on the other's shoulder. "God help you, my poor boy, if such pain is in your heart." Mr. Stonehouse looked out at the sea. At last, turning his face to him, again he spoke. "If you feel that I intrude on you, I earnestly ask you to forgive me, but I think that the years between your age and mine, as well as my feeling towards the great obligation which I owe you, will plead for excuse. There is something I would like to say to you, sir, but I suppose I must not without your permission. May I have it? If you wish, sir, I can at least hear it." The old man bowed and went on. "I could not but notice that you have some great grief bearing upon you, and from one thing or another, I can tell you the data if you wish me to do so. I have come to the conclusion that you are leaving your native land because of it." Here Harold wakened to amazement by the readiness with which his secret had been divined. said quickly, rather as an exclamation than interrogation, "How on earth did you know that?" His companion, taking it as a query, answered, "Sir, at your age and with your strength, life should be a joy, and yet you are sad. Companionship should be a pleasure, yet you prefer solitude. That you are brave and unselfish, I know. I have reason, thank God, to know it. That you are kindly and tolerant is apparent from your bearing to my little child this morning, as well as your goodness of last night, the remembrance of which her mother and I will bear to our graves, and to me now. I have not lived all these years without having had trouble in my own heart, and although the happiness of late years have made it dim, my gratitude to you who are so sad brings it all back to me." He bowed, and Harold, wishing to avoid speaking of his sorrow, said, "You are quite right. So far as I have a sorrow, and it is because of it I have turned my back on my home. Let it rest at that." His companion bowed gravely and went on. "I take it that you are going to begin life afresh in a new country. In such case, I have a proposition to make. I have a large business, a business so large that I am unable to manage it all myself. I was intending that when I arrived at home I would set about finding a partner. The man I want is not an ordinary man. He must have brains and strength and daring." He paused. Harold felt what was coming, but realized as he jumped at the conclusion that it would not do for him to take for granted that he was the man sought. He waited. Mr. Stonehouse went on. "As to brains, I am prepared to take the existence of such on my own judgment. I have been reading men, and in this aspect specially, all my life. The man I have thought of has brains. I am satisfied of that, without proof. I have proof of the other qualities." He paused again. As Harold said nothing, he continued in a manner ill at ease. "My difficulty is to make the proposal to the man I want. If it is so difficult to talk business to a man to whom you, under great obligation, to whom you owe everything, he might take a friendly overture ill." There was but one thing to be said, and Harold said it. His heart warmed to the kindly old man, and he wished to spare him pain, even if he could not accept his proposition. He couldn't take it ill, unless he was an awful bounder. It was you I thought of." "I thought so much, sir," said Harold, after a pause, "and I thank you earnestly and honestly, but it is impossible." "Oh, my dear sir," said the other, chagrined as well as surprised, "think again. It is really worth your while to think of it, no matter what your ultimate decision may be." Harold shook his head. There was a long silence. The old man wished to give his companion time to think, and indeed he thought that Harold was weighing the proposition in his mind. As for Harold, he was thinking how best he could make his absolute refusal inoffensive. He must, he felt, give some reason, and his thoughts were bent on how much of the truth he could safely give without endangering his secret. Therefore, he spoke at last in general terms. "I can only ask you, sir, to bear with me and to believe that I am very truly and sincerely grateful to you for your trust. But the fact is, I cannot go anywhere amongst people. Of course you understand that I am speaking in confidence, To you alone, and to no other." "Absolutely," said Mr. Stonehouse gravely. Harold went on. "I must be alone. I can only bear to see people on the ship because it is a necessary way to solitude." "You cannot go anywhere amongst people?" "Pardon me, I don't wish to be unduly inquisitive, but on my word I fail to understand." Harold was in a great difficulty. Common courtesy alone forbade that he should leave the matter where it was, and in addition, both the magnificently generous offer which had been made to him and the way in which accident had thrown him to such close intimacy with Pearl's family required that he should be at least fairly frank. At last, in a sort of cold desperation, he said, "I cannot meet anyone. There is something that happened, something I did. Nothing can make it right. All I can do is to lose myself in the wildest, grimmest wilderness in the world, and fight my pain, my shame." A long silence. Then the old man's voice came clear and sweet, something like music in the shelter from the storm. "But perhaps time may mend things. God is very good," Harold answered out of the bitterness of his heart. He felt that his words were laden with anger, which he did not feel, but he did not see his way to alter them. "Nothing can mend this thing. It is at the farthest point of evil, and there is no going on or coming back. Nothing can wipe out what is done, what is past." Again silence, and again the strong, gentle voice. "God can do much. Oh, my dear young friend, you have been such a friend to me and mine. Think of this. God himself can do nothing here. It is done, and that is the end." He turned his head. It was all he could do to keep from groaning. The old man's voice vibrated with earnest conviction as he spoke. "You are young and strong and brave. Your heart is noble. You can think quickly in moments of peril. Therefore, your brain is sound and alert. Now may I ask you a favor? It is not much, only that you will listen without interruption to what, if I have your permission, I am going to say. Do not ask me anything. Do not deny. Do not interrupt. Only listen. May I ask this? By all means. It is not much." He almost felt like smiling as he spoke. Mr. Stonehouse, after a short pause, as if arranging his thoughts, spoke. "Let me tell you what I am. I began life with nothing but a fair education such as all our American boys get. But from a good mother I got an idea that, to be honest, was the best of all things. From a strenuous father, who, however, could not do well for himself, I learned application to work and how best to use and exercise such powers as were in me. From the start things prospered for me. Men who knew me trusted me. Some came with offers to share in my enterprise. Thus I had command of what capital I could use. I was able to undertake great works and to carry them through. Fortune kept growing and growing, for as I got wealthier, I found newer and larger and more productive uses for my money. And in all my work, I can say, before God, I never willingly wronged any man. I am proud to be able to say that my name stands good, wherever it has been used. It may seem egotistical that I say such things of myself. It may seem bad taste, but I speak because I have a motive in so doing. I want you to understand at the outset that in my own country, wherever I am known, and in my own work, My name is a strength." He paused a while. Harold sat still. He knew that such a man could not, speak in such a way without a strong motive, and to learn that motive he waited. "When you were in the water, making what headway you could, in that awful sea, when my little child's life hung in the balance, and the anguish of my wife's heart nearly tore my heart in two, I said to myself, if we had a son, I should wish him to be like that. I meant it then, and I mean it now. Come to me as you are, faults and past, and all. Forget the past. Whatever it was, we will together try to wipe it out. Much may be done in restoring where there has been any wrongdoing. Take my name as your own. It will protect you from the result of whatever has been, and give you an opportunity to find your place again. You are not bad in heart, I know. Whatever you have done has not been from base motives. Few of us are spotless as to facts. You and I will show ourselves. For unless God wills to the opposite, we shall confide in none other, that a strong, brave man may win back all that was lost. Let me call you by my name and hold you as the son of my heart, and it will be a joy and pleasure to my declining years." As he had spoken, Harold's thoughts had at first followed in some wonderment, but gradually, as his noble purpose unfolded, based as it was on a misconception as to the misdoing of which he himself had spoken, he had been almost stricken dumb. At the first realization of what was intended, he could not have spoken had he tried, but at the end he had regained his thoughts and his voice. There was still wonderment in it, as realizing, from the long pause, that the old man had completed his suggestion, he spoke. "If I understand all right, you are offering me your name, offering to share your honour with me whom, if again I understand, you take as having committed some crime. I inferred from what you said and from your sadness, your desire to shun your kind, that there was, if not a crime, some fault that needed expiation. But your honour, sir, your honour—" There was a proud look in the old man's eyes as he said quickly, "It was my desire, is my desire, to share with you what I have that is best, and that, I take it, is not the least valuable of my possessions, such as they are. And why not? You have given to me all that makes life sweet, without which it would be unbearable. That child who came to my wife and me when I was old and she had passed her youth is all in all to us both. Had your strength and courage been for barter in the moments when my child was quivering between life and death, I would have cheerfully purchased them with not half but all. Sir, I should have given my soul. I can say this now, for gratitude is above all barter, and surely it is allowed to a father to show gratitude for the life of his child." The great-hearted generosity touched Harold to the quick. He could hardly speak for a few minutes. Then, instinctively grasping the old man's hand, he said, "You overwhelm me. Such noble trust and generosity as you have shown me demands a return of trust. But I must think. Will you remain here and let me return to you in a little while?" He rose quickly and slipped down the iron ladder, passing into the darkness and the mist and the flying spray. Chapter 27. Age's Wisdom. Harold went to and fro on the deserted deck. All at once, the course he had to pursue opened out before him. He was aware that what the noble-minded old man offered him was fortune, great fortune, in any part of the world. He would have to be refused, but the refusal should be gently done. He, believing that the other had done something very wrong, had still offered to share with him his name, his honour. Such confidence demanded full confidence in return. The unwritten laws which governed the men amongst whom he had been brought up required it, and the shape that confidence should take. He must first disabuse his new friend's mind of criminal or unworthy cause for his going away, for the sake of his own name and that of his dead father. That should be done. Then he would have to suggest the real cause. He would, in this, have to trust Mr. Stonehouse's honour for secrecy. But he was worthy of trust. He would, of course, give no name, no clue, but he would put things generally in a way that he could understand. When his mind was so far made up, he wanted to finish the matter, so he turned to the wheelhouse and climbed the ladder again. It was not till he sat in the shelter by his companion that he became aware that he had become wet with the spray. The old man, wishing to help him in his embarrassment, said, "Well." Harold began at once. The straightforward habit of his life stood to him now. "Let me say first, sir, what will I know? Give you pleasure." The old man extended his hand. He had been hoping for acceptance, and this seemed like it. Harold laid his hand on it for an instant only, and then raised it, as to say, "Wait. You have been so good to me, so nobly generous in your wishes, that I feel I owe you a certain confidence. But as it concerns not myself alone, I will ask that it be kept a secret between us two, not to be told to any other, not even your wife. I will hold your secret sacred, even from my wife, the first secret I shall have ever kept from her. First, then, let me say, and this is what I know will rejoice you, that I am not leaving home and country because of any crime I have committed, not from any offence against God or man or law. Thank God, I am free from such. I have always tried to live uprightly." Here a burst of pain overcame him, and with a dry sob he added, "And that is what makes the terrible unfairness of it all." The old man laid a kindly hand on his shoulder and kept it there for a few moments. "My poor boy, was all he said. Harold shook himself as if to dislodge the bitter thoughts mastering himself. He went on, "There was a lady with whom I was very much thrown in contact since we were children. Her father was my father's friend, my friend too. God knows, for almost with his dying breath he gave sanction to my marrying his daughter, if it should ever be that she should care for me in that way. But he wished me to wait, and till she was old enough to choose, to leave her free, for she is several years younger than I am, and I am not very old yet, except in heart. All this, you understand, was said in private to me. None other knew it. None knew of it even till this moment, when I tell you that such a thing has been." He paused, the other said, "Believe me that I value your confidence beyond all words." Harold felt already the good effects of being able to speak of his pent-up trouble. Already this freedom from the nightmare, loneliness of his own thoughts seemed to be freeing his very soul. I honestly kept to his wishes. Before God I did. No man who loved a woman, honoured her, worshipped her, could have been more scrupulously careful as to leaving her free. What it was to me to so hold myself, no one knows. No one ever will know, for I loved her, do love her, with every nerve and fibre of my heart. All our lives we had been friends, and I believed we loved and trusted each other. But then there came a day when I found by chance that a great trouble threatened her, not from anything wrong that she had done, but from something perhaps foolish, harmlessly foolish, except that she did not know. He stopped suddenly, fearing he might have said overmuch of Stephen's side of the affair. When I came to her aid, however, meaning the best, and as single-minded as a man can be, she misunderstood my words, my meaning, my very coming, and she said things which cannot be unsaid. Matters were so fixed that I could not explain, and had to listen. She said things that I did not believe she could have said to me, to anyone, things that I did not think she could have thought. I dare say she was right in some ways. I suppose I bungled in my desire to be unselfish. What she said came to me in new lights upon what I had done. But anyhow, her statements were such that I felt I could not, should not remain. My very presence must have been a trouble to her hereafter. There was nothing for it but to come away. There was no place for me, no hope for me. There is none on this side of the grave, for I love her still, more than ever. I honour and worship her still, and ever will, and ever must. I am content to forego my own happiness, but I feel there is a danger to her from what has been, that there is and must be to her unhappiness even from the fact that it was I who was the object of her wrath, and this adds to my woe. Worst of all is the thought and the memory that she should have done so, she who... He turned away, overcome, and hid his face in his hands. The old man sat still. He knew that at such a moment silence is the best form of sympathy, but his heart glowed. The wisdom of his years told him that he had heard as yet of no absolute bar to his friend's ultimate happiness. "I am rejoiced, my dear boy, at what you tell me of your own conduct. It would have been made no difference to me had it been otherwise, but it would have meant a harder and longer climb back to the place you should hold. But it really seems that nothing is so hopeless as you think. Believe me, my dear young friend, who are now as a son to my heart, that there will be bright days for you yet." He paused a moment, but, mastering himself, went on in a quiet voice. "I think you are wise to go away. In the solitudes and in danger, things that are little, in reality, will find their true perspective, and things that are worthy will appear in their constant majesty." He stood, and, laying once again his hand on the young man's shoulder, said, "I recognize that we, for my wife and little girl, would be at one with me in my wish, did they know of it, must not keep you from your purpose of fighting out your trouble alone. Every man, as the Scottish proverb says, must dree his own weird. I must not, ask you for any promise, but I trust that if ever you do come back, you will make us all glad by seeing you. And remember that what I said of myself and of all I have all holds good, so long as I shall live." Before Harold could reply, he had slipped down the ladder and was gone. During the rest of the voyage, with the exception of one occasion, he did not allude to the subject again by word or implication, and Harold was grateful to him for it. On the night before Fire Island should be sighted, Harold was in the bow of the great ship, looking out with eyes in which gleamed no hope. To him came through the darkness Mr. Stonehouse. He heard the footsteps and knew them, so, with the instinct of courtesy, knowing that his friend would not intrude on his solitude without purpose, he turned and met him. When the American stood beside him, he said, studiously avoiding looking at his companion, "This is the last night we shall be together, and, if I may, there is one thing I would like to say to you." "Say all you like, sir," said Harold, as heartily as he could. "I am sure it is well meant, and for that, at any rate, I shall be grateful to you. You will yet be grateful, I think," he answered gravely. "When it comes back to you in loneliness and solitude, you will, I believe, think it worth being grateful for. I don't mean that you will be grateful to me, but for the thing itself. I speak out of the wisdom of many years. At your time of life, the knowledge cannot come from observation. It may, my poor boy, come through pain, and if what I think is correct, you will even in due time be grateful to the pain which left such golden residuum." He passed, and Harold grew interested. There was something in the old man's manner which presaged a truth. He at last believed it. So the young man listened at first with his ears, and, as the other spoke, his heart listened too. Young men are apt to think somewhat wrongly of women they love and respect. We are apt to think that such women are of a different clay from ourselves, nay, that they are not compact of clay at all, but of some faultless, flawless material which the Almighty keeps for such fine work. It is only in middle age that men, except scamps who learn this bad side of knowledge young, realize that women are human beings like themselves. It may be, you know, that you may have misjudged this young lady, that you have not made sufficient allowance for her youth, her nature, even the circumstances under which she spoke. You have told me that she was in some deep grief or trouble. May it not have been that this in itself unnerved her, distorted her views, aroused her passion till all within and around was tinged with the jaundice of her concern, her humiliation, whatever it was that destroyed for the time that normal self which you had known for so long? May it not have been that her bitterest memory, even since, may be of the speaking of these very words which sent you out into the wide world to hide yourself from men? I have thought, waking and sleeping, of your position ever since you honoured me with your confidences, and with every hour the conviction has strengthened in me that there is a way out of this situation, which sends a man like you into solitude, with a heart hopeless and full of pain, and which leaves her, perhaps, in a greater pain, for she has not, like you, the complete sense of innocence. But at present there is no way out but through time and thought. Whatever may be her idea or wishes, she is powerless. She does not know your thoughts, no matter how she may guess at them. She does not know where you are or how to reach you, no matter how complete her penitence may be. And oh, my dear young friend, remember that you are a strong man, and she is a woman, only a woman, in her passion and her weakness after all. Think this over, my poor boy. You will have time and opportunity where you are going. God help you to judge wisely. After a pause of a few seconds, he said abruptly, "Good night," and moved quickly away. When the time for parting came, Pearl was inconsolable, not knowing any reason why the man should not do as she wished. She was persistent in her petitions to Harold that he should come with her, and to her father and mother that they should induce him to do so. Mrs. Stonehouse would have wished him to join them, if only for a time. Her husband, unable to give any hint without betraying confidence, had to content himself with trying to appease his little daughter by vague hopes, rather than promises, that her friend would join them at some other time. When the scoriac was warped at the pier, there was a tendency on the part of the passengers to give Harold a sort of public send-off, but becoming aware of it, he hurried down the gangway without waiting, having only hand luggage, for he was to get his equipment in New York. He had cleared and passed the ring of customs officers before the most expeditious of the other passengers had collected their baggage. He had said good-bye to the Stonehouses in their own cabin. Pearl had been so much affected at saying good-bye, and his heart had so warmed to her, that at last he had said impulsively, "Don't cry, darling. If I'm spared, I shall come back to you within 3 years. Perhaps I will write before then, but there are not many post offices where I am going to." Children are easily satisfied. Their trust makes a promise a real thing, and its acceptance is the beginning of satisfaction. But for weeks after the parting, she had often fits of deep depression, and at such times her tears always flowed. She took note of the date, and there was never a day that she did not think of and sigh for the man. And the man, away in the wilds of Alaska, was feeling day by day and hour by hour the chastening and purifying influences of the wilderness. Hot passions cooled before the breath of the snowfield and the glacier. The moaning of a tortured spirit was lost in the roar of the avalanche and the scream of the cyclone. Pale sorrow and cold despair were warmed and quickened by the fierce sunlight, which came suddenly and stayed only long enough to vitalize all nature, and as the first step to understanding, the man forgot himself. Chapter 28. de Noir. 2 years. Not much to look back upon, but to look forward to. To Stephen, dowered though she was with rare personal gifts and with wealth and position, according to but a few, the hours of waiting were longer than the years that were past. Yet the time had new and startling incidents for her. Towards Christmas, in the second year, the Boer War had reached its climax of evil, as the news of disaster after disaster was flashed through the cable. She, like others, felt appalled at the sacrifices that were being exacted by the god of war. One day she casually read in the Times that the Earl of Noir had died in his London mansion, and further learned that he had never recovered from the shock of hearing that his 2 sons and his nephew had been killed. The paragraph concluded, by his death, the title passes to a distant relative. The new Lord de Noir is at present in India with his regiment, the 35th or the Grey Hussars, of which he is colonel. She gave the matter a more than passing thought, for it was sad to find a whole family thus wiped out at a blow. Early in February she received a telegram from her London solicitor, saying that he wished to see her on an important matter. Her answer was, "Come at once," and at tea-time Mr. Coppleston arrived. He was an old friend, and she greeted him warmly. She was a little chilled when he answered with what seemed unusual deference. I thank your ladyship for your kindness." She raised her eyebrows, but made no comment. She was learning to be silent under surprise. When she had handed the old gentleman his tea, she said, "My aunt has chosen to remain away, thinking that you might wish to see me privately, but I take it that there is nothing which she may not share. I have no secrets from her." He rubbed his hands genially as he replied, "Not at all, not at all. I should like her to be present. It will, I am sure, be a delight to us all." Again raised eyebrows, again silence on the subject. When a servant answered her bell, she told him to ask Miss Rowley if she would kindly join them. Aunt Letitia and the solicitor were old cronies, and their greeting was most friendly. When the old gentlewoman had seated herself and taken her cup of tea, Mr. Coppleston said to Stephen with a sort of pomposity, "I have to announce your succession to the earldom de Noir." Stephen sat quite still. She knew the news was true. Mr. Coppleston was not one who would jest on a business subject, and too accurate a lawyer to make an error in a matter of fact. But the fact did not seem to touch her. It was not that she was indifferent to it. Few women could hear such news without a thrill. Mr. Coppleston seemed at a loss. Miss Rowley rose and quietly kissed her, and, saying simply, "God bless you, my dear," went back to her seat. Realizing that Mr. Coppleston expected some acknowledgment, Stephen held out her hand to him and said quietly, "Thank you." After a long pause, she added quietly, "Now, won't you tell us about it? I am in absolute ignorance, and don't understand." "I had better not burden you at first with too many details, which can come later, but give you a rough survey of the situation. Your title of Countess de Lambois comes to you through your ancestor, Isabel, third and youngest daughter of the 6th Earl, Messrs. Collenbray and Jackson. Knowing that my firm acted for your family, communicated with us. Lest there should be any error, we followed most carefully every descendant and every branch of the family, for we thought it best not to communicate with you till your right of inheritance was beyond dispute. We arrived independently at the same result as Messrs. Collenbray and Jackson. There is absolutely no doubt whatever of your claim. You will petition the Crown, and on reference to the House of Lords, the Committee for Privileges will admit your right. May I offer my congratulations, Lady de Lanoir, on your acquisition? By the way, I must say that all the estates of the earldom, which have been from the first kept in strict entail, go with the title de Lanoir. During the recital, Stephen was conscious of a sort of bitter comment on the tendencies of good fortune. Too late, something seemed to whisper. What a delight it would have been had father inherited. If Harold had not gone, all the natural joy seemed to vanish, as bubbles break into empty air. To Aunt Letitia, the new title was a source of pride and joy, far greater than would have been the case had it come to herself. She had for so many years longed for new honours for Stephen that she had almost come to regard them as a right whose coming should not be too long delayed. Miss Rowley had never been to Lanoir, and indeed she knew personally nothing of the country Angleshire in which it was situated. She was naturally anxious to see the new domain, but kept her feeling concealed during the months that elapsed until Stephen's right had been conceded by the Committee for Privileges. But after that, her impatience became manifest to Stephen, who said one day, in a teasing, caressing way, as was sometimes her wont, "Why, Auntie, what a hurry you are in! Lanoir will keep, won't it?" "Oh, my dear," she replied, shaking her head, "I can understand your own reticence, for you don't want to seem greedy and in a hurry about your new possessions. But when people come to my age, there's no time to waste. I feel I would not have complete material for happiness in the world to come if there were not a remembrance of my darling in her new home." Stephen was much touched. She said impulsively, "We shall go tomorrow, Auntie." "No, let us go today." "You shall not wait an hour that I can help." She ran to the bell, but before her hand was on the cord, the other said, "Not yet, Stephen dear. It would flurry me to start all at once. Tomorrow will be time enough, and that will give you time to send word, so that they will be prepared for your coming." How often do we look for that tomorrow which never comes? How often do we find that its looked-for rosy tints are none other than the gloom-laden grey of the present? Before the morrow sun was high in the heavens, Stephen was hurriedly summoned to her aunt's bedside. She lay calm and peaceful, but one side of her face was alive and the other seemingly dead. In the night, a paralytic stroke had seized her. The doctors said she might in time recover a little, but she would never be her old active self again. She herself, with much painful effort, managed to convey to Stephen that she knew the end was near. Stephen, knowing the wish of her heart, and thinking that it might do her good to gratify her wish, asked if she should arrange that she should be brought to Noir. Feebly and slowly, word by word, she managed to convey her idea. "Not now, dear one. I shall see it all in time, soon, and I shall understand and rejoice." For a long time she lay still, holding with her right hand, which was not paralyzed, the other's hand. Then she murmured, "You will find happiness there." She said no more, but seemed to sleep. From that sleep she never woke, but faded slowly, softly away. Stephen was broken-hearted. Now, indeed, she felt alone and desolate. All were gone, father, uncle, aunt, and Harold. The kingdoms of the earth which lay at her feet were of no account. 1 hour of the dead or departed, any of them back again, were worth them all. Normanstown was now too utterly lonely to be endurable, so Stephen determined to go for a time, at any rate, to Noir. She was becoming accustomed to be called my lady, and your ladyship, and the new loneliness made her feel better prepared to take her place amongst the new surroundings. In addition, there was another spur to her going. Leonard Everard, knowing of her absolute loneliness and feeling that it was a possibility of renewing his old status, was beginning to make himself apparent. He had learned by experience a certain wisdom and did not put himself forward obtrusively, but whenever they met, he looked at her so meekly and so lovingly that it brought remembrances which came with blushes. So all at once, without giving time for the news to permeate through the neighbourhood, she took her way to Noir with a few servants. Stephen's life had hitherto been spent inland. She had, of course, now and again been for short periods to various places, but the wonder of the sea as a constant companion had been practically unknown to her. Now at her new home its full splendour burst upon her, and so impressed itself upon her that new life seemed to open. Noir was on the northeastern coast, the castle standing at the base of a wide promontory stretching far into the North Sea. From the coast, the land sloped upward to a great rolling ridge. The outlook seaward was over a mighty expanse of green sward, dotted here and there with woods and isolated clumps of trees, which grew fewer and smaller as the rigour of the northern sea was borne upon them by the easterly gales. The coast was a wild and lonely one. No habituation other than an isolated fisher's cottage was to be seen between the little fishing port and the northern curve away to the south, where, beyond a waste of sandhills and strand, another tiny fishing village nestled under a high cliff, sheltering it from northerly wind. For centuries, the lords of Noir had kept their magnificent prospect to themselves, and though they had treated their farmers and cottagers well, none had ever been allowed to settle in the great park to seaward of the castle. From the terrace of the castle, then one building, other than the cottage, on the headland could be seen. Far off, on the very crest of the ridge, was the tower of an old windmill. Chapter 29. The Silver Lady. When it was known that Lady de Lenoir had come to Lenoir, there was a prompt rush of such callers as the country afforded. Stephen, however, did not wish to see anyone just at present, partly to avoid the chance meeting with strangers, and partly because she enjoyed and benefited by the exercise. She was much away from home every day. Sometimes, attended only by a groom, she rode long distances north and south along the coast, or up over the ridge behind the castle, and far inland along the shaded roads through the woods, or over bleak, wind-swept stretches of moorland. Sometimes she would walk, all alone, far down the sea road, and sit for hours on the shore, or high up on some little rocky headland, where she would enjoy the luxury of solitude. Now and again in her journeyings she made friends, most of them humble ones. She was so great as a lady in her station that she could be familiar without seeming to condescend. The fishermen of the little ports to the north and south came to know her and to look gladly for her coming. Their good wives had for her always a willing courtesy and a ready smile. As for the children, they looked on her with admiration and love, tempered with awe. She was so gentle with them, so ready to share their pleasures and interests, that after a while they came to regard her as some strange embodiment of fairydom and dreamland. Many a little heart was made glad by the arrival of some item of delight from the castle, and the hearts of the sick seemed never to hope, or their eyes to look in vain. One friend she made, who became very dear and of great import. Often she had looked up at the old windmill on the crest of the ridge, and wondered who inhabited it, for that someone lived in it, or close by, was shown at times by the drifting smoke. One day she made up her mind to go and see for herself. She had a fancy not to ask anyone about it. The place was a little item of mystery, and as such to be treasured and exploited, and in due course explored. The mill itself was picturesque, and the detail, at closer acquaintance, sustained the far-off impression. The roadway forked on the near side of the mill, reuniting again the further side, so that the place made a sort of island mill out of offices and garden. As the mill was on the very top of the ridge, the garden which lay seawards was sheltered by the building from the west, and from the east by a thick hedge of thorn and privet, which quite hid it from the roadway. Stephen took the lower road, finding no entrance save a locked wooden door. She followed round to the western side, where the business side of the mill had been. It was all still now and silent, and that it had long fallen into disuse was shown by the grey faded look of everything. Grass, green and luxuriant, grew untrodden between the cobblestones with which the yard was paved. There was a sort of old-world quietude about everything which greatly appealed to Stephen. Stephen dismounted and walked round the yard, admiring everything. She did not feel as if intruding, for the gateway was wide open. A low door in the base of the mill tower opened, and a maid appeared, a demure, pretty little thing of 16 or 17 years, dressed in a prim straight dress and an old-fashioned Puritan cap. Seeing a stranger, she made an ejaculation and drew back hastily. Stephen called out to her, "Don't be afraid, little girl. Will you kindly tell me who lives here?" The answer came with some hesitation. "Sister Ruth." "And who is Sister Ruth?" The question came instinctively and without premeditation. The maid, embarrassed, held hard to the half-open door and shifted from foot to foot uneasily. "I don't know," she said at last. "Only Sister Ruth, I suppose." It was manifest that the matter had never afforded her anything in the nature of a problem. There was an embarrassing silence. Stephen did not wish to seem or even to be prying, but her curiosity was aroused. What manner of a woman was this, who lived so manifestly alone, and who had but a Christian name? Stephen, however, had all her life been accustomed to dominance, and Normanstand and Norwood had made many acquaintances amongst her poorer neighbours. She was just about to ask if she might see Sister Ruth, when behind the maid, in the dark of the low passageway, appeared the tall, slim figure of a silver woman. Truly a silver woman. The first flash of Stephen's thought was correct. White-haired, white-faced, white-capped, white-kerchiefed, in a plain-cut dress of light grey silk, without adornment of any kind. The whole ensemble was as a piece of old silver. The lines of her face were very dignified, very sweet, very beautiful. Stephen felt at once that she was in the presence of no common woman, so she looked an admiration which all her Quaker garments could not forbid the other to feel. She was not the first to speak. In such a noble presence, the dignity of Stephen's youth imperatively demanded silence, if not humility. So she waited. The Silver Lady, for so Stephen ever after held her in her mind, said quietly, but with manifest welcome, "Didn't thou wish to see me? Wilt thou come in?" Stephen answered frankly, "I should like to come in, if you will not think me rude. The fact is, I was struck when riding by with the beautiful situation of the mill. I thought it was only an old mill till I saw the garden hedges and came round to ask if I might go in." The Silver Lady came forward at a pace that by itself expressed warmth, as she said heartily, "Indeed, thou mayest. Stay, it is tea time. Let us put thy horse in one of the sheds. There is no man here at present to do it. Then thou shalt come with me and see my beautiful view." She was about to take the horse herself, but Stephen forestalled her with a quick, "No, pray let me. I'm quite accustomed." She led the horse to the shed, and, having looped the rein over a hook, patted him and ran back. The Silver Lady gave her a hand, and they entered the dark passage together. Stephen was thinking if she ought to begin by telling her name, but the Harun al-Rashid feeling for adventure incognito is an intimate principle of the sons of men. It was seldom indeed that her life had afforded her such an opportunity. The Silver Lady, on her own part, also wished for silence as she looked for the effect on her companion when the glory of the view should break upon her. When they had climbed the winding stone stair, which led up some 20 feet, there was a low, wide landing with the remains of the main shaft of the mill machinery running through it. From one side rose a stone stair, curving with the outer wall of the mill tower and guarded by a heavy iron rail. A dozen steps there were, and then a landing, a couple of yards square. Then a deep doorway cut in the thickness of the wall, round which the winding stair continued. The Silver Lady, who had led the way, threw open the door and motioned to her guest to enter. Stephen stood for a few moments, surprised as well as delighted, for the room before her, as not like anything which she had ever seen or thought of. It was a section of almost the whole tower, and was of considerable size, for the machinery and even the inner shaft had been removed. East and south and west, the wall had been partially cut away, so that great, wide windows, nearly the full height of the room, showed the magnificent panorama. In the depths of the ample windows were little cloistered nooks where one might, with a feeling of super-solitude, be away from and above the world. The room was beautifully furnished, and everywhere were flowers, with leaves and sprays and branches, where possible. Even from where she stood in the doorway, Stephen had a bird's-eye view of the whole countryside, not only of the coast, with which she was already familiar, and on which her windows at the castle looked, but to the south and west, which the hill, rising steep behind the castle and to southward, shut out. The Silver Lady could not but notice her guest's genuine admiration. "Thou likest my room and my view? There is no use asking thee. I see thou dost." Stephen answered with a little gasp. "I think it is the quaintest and most beautiful place I have ever seen." "I am so glad thou'st like it. I have lived here for nearly 40 years, and they have been years of unutterable peace and earthly happiness. And now thou wilt have some tea?" Stephen left the mill that afternoon with a warmth of heart that she had been a stranger to for many a day. The two women had accepted each other simply. "I'm called Ruth," said the Silver Lady. "And I'm Stephen," said Countess of Noir in reply. And that was all. Neither had any clue to the other's identity. Stephen felt that some story lay behind that calm, sweet personality. Much sorrow goes to the making of fearless quietude. The Quaker lady moved so little out of her own environment that she did not even suspect the identity of her visitor. All that she knew of change was a notice from the solicitor to the estate that, as the headship had lapsed into another branch of the possessing family, she must be prepared, if necessary, to vacate her tenancy, which was one at will. It was not long before Stephen availed herself of the permission to come again. This time she made up her mind to tell who she was, lest the concealment of her identity might lead to awkwardness. At that meeting, friendship became union. The natures of the two women expanded to each other, and after a very few meetings, there was established between them a rare confidence. Even the personal austerity of Quakerdom, or the state and estate of the peeress, could not come between. Their friendship seemed to be for the life of one. To the other it would be a memory. The Silver Lady never left the chosen routine of her own life. Whatever was the reason of her giving up the world, she kept it to herself, and Stephen respected her reticence as much as she did her confidence. It became a habit early in their friendship for Stephen to ride or walk over to the windmill in the dusk of the evening when she felt especially lonely. On one such occasion she pushed open the outer door, which was never shut, and took her way up the stone stair. She knew she would find her friend seated in the window with hands folded on lap, looking out into the silent dusk with the absorbed understanding of things which is holier than reverence and spirituality, more active than conscious prayer. She tapped the door lightly and stepped into the room. With a glad exclamation which, coming through the habitual sedatedness, showed how much she loved the young girl, Sister Ruth started to her feet. There was something of such truth in the note she had sounded that the lonely girl's heart went out to her in abandoned fullness. She held out her arms, and as she came close to the other, fell rather than sank at her feet. The elder woman recognized and knew. She made no effort to restrain her, but, sinking back into her own seat, laid the girl's head in her lap, and held her hands close against her breast. "Tell me," she whispered. "Won't you tell me, dear child, what troubles you? Tell me, dear, it may bring peace." "Oh, I am miserable, miserable, miserable," moaned Stephen in a low voice, whose despair made the other's heart grow cold. The Silver Lady knew that her golden silence was the best of help. Holding close to the other's hands, she waited. Stephen's breast began to heave. With an impulsive motion, she drew away her hands and put them before her burning face, which she pressed lower still on the other's lap. Sister Ruth knew that the trouble, whatever it was about to find a voice, and then came in a low, shuddering whisper, a voice muffled in the folds of the dress. "I killed a man." In all her life, the Silver Lady had never been so startled or so shocked. She had grown so to love the bright, brilliant young girl that the whispered confession cut through the silence of the dusk as a shriek of murder goes through the silent gloom of night. Her hands flew wide from her breast, and the convulsive shudder which shook her all in an instant woke Stephen through all her own deep emotion to the instinct of protection of the other. The girl looked up, shaking her head, and said, with a sadness which stilled all the other's fear, "Ah, don't be frightened. It is not murder that I tell you of. Perhaps if it were, the thought would be easier to bear. He would have been hurt less if it had been only his body that I slew. Well, I know now that his life would have been freely given if I wished it, if it had been for my good. But it was the best of him that I killed. His soul, his noble, loving, trusting, unselfish soul, the bravest and truest soul that ever had place in a man's breast." Her speaking ended with a sob. Her body sank lower. Sister Ruth's heart began to beat more freely. She understood now, and all the womanhood, all the wifehood, motherhood, suppressed for a lifetime, awoke to the woman's need. Gently she stroked the beautiful head that lay so meekly on her lap, and as the girl sobbed with but little appearance of abatement, she said to her softly, "Tell me, dear child, tell me all about it. See, we are alone together, thou and I and God, in God's dusk, with only the silent land and sea before us. Won't thou trust me, dear one, and speak?" And then, as the shadows fell, and far-off lights at sea began to twinkle over the waste of waters, Stephen found voice and told without reserve the secret of her shame and her remorse. At last, when her broken voice had trailed away into gentle catchings of the breath, the older woman, knowing that the time, come for comfort, took her in her strong arms, holding her face wet against her own, their tears mingling. "Cry on, dear heart," she said, as she kissed her. "Cry on. It will do thee good." She was startled once again, as the other seemed for an instant to grow rigid in her arms, and, raising her hands, cried out in a burst of almost hysterical passion, "Cry, cry, cry! Oh, my God, my God!" Then, becoming conscious of her wet face, she seemed to become in an instant all limp, and sank on her knees again. There was so different a note in her voice that the other's heart leaped as she heard her say, "God be thanked for these tears. Oh, thank God, thank God." Looking up, she saw, through the gloom, the surprise in her companion's eyes, and answered their query in words. "Oh, you don't know, you can't know, what it is to me. I have not cried since last I saw him pass from me in the wood." That time of confusion seemed to have, in some way, cleared, purified, and satisfied Stephen's soul. Life was now easier to bear. She was able to adapt herself, justify the needs of her position, and all around her and dependent on her began to realize that amongst them was a controlling force, far-reaching sympathy, and a dominant resolution that made for good. She began to shake off the gloom of her sorrows, and to take her place in her new high station. Friends there were in many, and quondam lovers by the score, lovers of all sorts. Fortune hunters there were, be sure, not a few, but no need was there for baseness when the lady herself was so desirable, so young, so fair, so lovable. That she was of great estate and richly left made all things possible to any man who had sufficient acquisitiveness or a good conceit of himself. In a wide circle of country were many true lovers who would have done aught to win her praise, and so in the East the passing of the 2 years of silence and gloom seemed to be the winning of something brighter to follow. Chapter 30. The Lesson of the Wilderness. In the West, the 2 years flew. Time seemed to go faster there, because life was more strenuous. Harold, being mainly alone, found endless work always before him. From daylight to dark, labour never ceased, and for his own part, he never wished that it should. In the wilderness, and especially under such conditions as held in northern Alaska, labour is not merely mechanical. Every hour of the day is fraught with danger in some new form, and the head has to play its part in the strife against nature. in such a life there is not much time for thinking or brooding. At first, when the work and his surroundings were strange to him, Harold did many useless things and ran many unnecessary risks. But his knowledge grew with experience. Privations he had in plenty, and all the fibre of his body and the strength of his resolution and endurance were now and again taxed to their utmost. But with a man of his nature and race, the breaking strain is high, and endurance and resolution are qualities which develop with practice. Gradually his mind came back to normal level. He had won seemingly through the pain that shadowed him. Without anguish, he could not think, remember, look forward. Then it was the kindly wisdom of the American came back to him and came to stay. He began to examine himself as to his own part of the unhappy transaction, and stray moments of wonderment came as to whether the fault may not at the very base have his own. He began to realize that it is insufficient in the strenuous world to watch and wait, to suppress oneself, to put aside, in the wish to benefit others, all the hopes, ambitions, cravings which make for personal gain. Thus it was that Harold's thoughts, ever circling round Stephen, came back with increasing insistence to the duty towards her. He often thought, and with a bitter feeling against himself, that it came too late, of the dying trust of her father. Guard her and cherish her as if you were indeed my son, and she your sister. If it should be that you and Stephen should find that there is another affection between you, remember, I sanction it. But give her time. I trust that to you. She is young, and the world is all before her. Let her choose, and be loyal to her. If it is another, it may be a hard task, but I trust you, Harold. Here he would groan, as all the anguish of the past would rush back upon him, and keenest of all would be the fear, suspicion, thought, which grew towards belief that he may have betrayed that trust. At first the side of this memory, personal to his own happiness, was faintly emphasized. The important side was of the duty to Stephen. But as time went on, the other thought became a sort of corollary, a timid, halting, blushing thought which followed sheepishly, borne down by trembling hope. No matter what adventure came to him, the thought of neglected duty returned ever afresh. Once when he lay sick for weeks in an Indian wigwam, the idea so grew with each day of the monotony that when he was able to crawl out by himself into the sunshine, he had almost made up his mind to start back for home. Luck is a strange thing. It seems in some mysterious way to be the divine machinery for adjusting averages. Whatever may be the measure of happiness or unhappiness, good or evil, allotted to anyone, luck is the cause or means of counterbalancing so that the main result reaches the standard set. From the time of Harold's illness, Dame Fortune seemed to change her attitude to him. The fierce frown, nay, the malignant scowl, to which he had become accustomed, changed to a smile. Hitherto everything seemed to have gone wrong with him, but now, all at once, all seemed to go right. He grew strong and hardy again. Indeed, he seemed, by contrast to his late helplessness, to be so strong and hard that it looked as if that very illness had done him good instead of harm. Game was plentiful, and he never seemed to want. Everywhere he went, there were traces of gold, as though by some instinct he was tracking it to its home. He did not value gold for its own sake, but he did for the ardour of the search. Harold was essentially a man, and as a man, an adventurer. To such a man of such a race, adventure is the very salt of existence. The adventurer's instinct took with it the adventurer's judgment. Harold was not content with small results. Amidst the vast primeval forces there were, he felt vast results of their prehistoric working, and he determined to find some of them. In such a quest, purpose is much. It was hardly any wonder then that, in time, Harold found himself alone in the midst of one of the great treasure places of the world. Only labour was needed to take from the earth riches beyond the dreams of avarice. But that labour was no easy problem. Great and difficult distance had to be overcome. Secrecy must be observed, for even a whisper of the existence of such a place would bring a horde of desperadoes. But all these difficulties were at least sources of interest, if not in themselves pleasures. The new Harold, seemingly freshly created by a year of danger and strenuous toil, of self-examining and humiliation, of the realization of duty, and though he knew it is not as yet, of the dawning of hope, found delight in the thought of dangers and difficulties to be overcome. Having taken his bearings exactly so as to be safe in finding the place again, he took his specimens with him and set out to find the shortest and best route to the nearest port. At length he came to the port and set quietly about finding men. This he did very carefully and very systematically. Finally, with the full complement and with ample supply of stores, he started on his expedition to the new goldfields. It is not proposed to set out here the extraordinary growth of Robinson City, for thus the mining camp soon became. Its history has long ago been told for all the world. In the early days, when everything had to be organized and protected, Harold worked like a giant and with a system and energy, which from the first established him as a master. But when the second year of his exile was coming to a close, and Robinson City was teeming with life and commerce, when banks and police and soldiers made life and property comparatively safe, he began to be restless again. This was not the life to which he had set himself. He had gone into the wilderness to be away from cities and from men, and here a city had sprung up around him, and men claimed him as their chief. Moreover, with the restless feeling, there began to come back to him the old thoughts and the old pain. But he felt strong enough by this time to look forward in life as well as backward. With him now, to think was to act. So much, at least, he had gained from his position of dominance in an upspringing city. He quietly considered such outlying interests as he had placed the management of his great estate in the hands of a man he had learned to trust, and giving out that he was going to San Francisco to arrange some business, left Robinson City. He had already accumulated such a fortune that the world was before him in any way he might choose to take. Knowing that at San Francisco, to which he had booked, he would have to run the gauntlet of certain of his friends and business connections, he made haste to leave the ship quietly at Portland, the first point she touched on her southern journey. Thence he got to the Canadian Pacific Line and took his way to Montreal. What most arrested his attention, and in a very disconcerting way, were the glimpses of English life one sees and reproduced so faithfully here and there in Canada. The whole of the past rushed back on him so overpoweringly that he was, for the moment, unnerved. The acute feeling of course soon became mitigated, but it was the beginning of a realization of what had been, and which grew stronger with each mile as the train swept back eastward. At first he tried to fight it, tried with all the resources of his strong nature. His mind was made up, he assured himself over and over again. The past was past, and what had been was no more to him than to any of the other passengers of the train. Destiny had long ago fulfilled itself. Stephen, no doubt, had by now found someone worthy of her and had married. In no dream, sleeping or waking, could he ever admit that she had married Leonard. That was the only gleam of comfort in what had grown to be remorse for his neglected duty. And so it was that Harold and Wolfe slowly drifted, though he knew it not, into something of the same intellectual position which had dominated him when he had started on his journeying, and the sunset fell nightly on his despairing face. The life in the wilderness, and then in the dominance and masterdom of enterprise, had hardened and strengthened him into more self-reliant manhood, giving him greater forbearance and a more practical view of things. When he took ship in the Dominion, a large cargo boat with some passengers running to London, he had a vague purpose of visiting in secret Norster, whence he could manage to find out how matters were at Normanstand. He would then, he felt, be in a better position to regulate his further movements. He knew that he had already a sufficient disguise in his great beard. He had nothing to fear from the tracing of him on his journey from Alaska, or the interest of his fellow passengers. He had all along been so fortunate as to be able to keep his identity concealed. The name John Robinson told nothing in itself, and the width of a whole great continent lay between him and the place of his fame. He was able to take his part freely amongst both the passengers and the officers. Even amongst the crew he soon came to be known. The men liked his geniality and instinctively respected his enormous strength and his manifest force of character. Men who work and who know danger soon learn to recognize the forces which overcome both, and as sufficient time had not elapsed to impair his hardihood or lower his vast strength, he was facile princeps, and so the crew acknowledged him. To them he was a born captain whom to obey would be a natural duty. After some days the weather changed. The great ship, which usually rested even-keeled on two waves, and whose bilge keels under normal conditions rendering rolling impossible, began to pitch and roll like a leviathan at play. The decks swept by gigantic seas, were injured wherever was anything to injure. Bulwarks were torn away as though they had been compact of paper. More than once the double doors at the head of the companion stairs had been driven in. The bull's-eye glasses of some of the ports were beaten from their brazen sockets. Nearly all the boats had been wrecked, broken, or torn from their cranes as the great ship rolled heavily in the trough of giant waves had struck her till she quivered like a frightened horse. At the season she sailed on the far northern course. Driven still farther north by the gales, she came within a short way of south of Greenland. Then, avoiding Moville, which should have been her place of call, she ran down the east of Britain, the wild weather still prevailing. Chapter 31. The Lifeline. On the coast of Angleshire, the weather in the early days of September had been stormy. With the southwest wind had come deluges of rain, not a common thing for the time of year on the east coast. Stephen, whose spirits always rose with high winds, was in a condition of prolonged excitement. She could not keep still. Every day she rode long distances, and found a wonderful satisfaction in facing the strong winds. Like a true horsewoman, she did not mind the wet, and had glorious gallops over the grassy ridge and down the slopes on the farther side, out on the open road, or through the endless grass rides amid the pine woods. On the Tuesday morning the storm was in full sweep, and Stephen was in wild spirits. Nothing would do her but to go out on the tower of the castle, where she could walk about and, leaning on the crenellated parapet, look over all the coast, stretching far in front and sweeping away to the left and right. The prospect so enchanted her, and the fierce sweep of the wind so suited her exalted mood, that she remained there all the morning. The whole coast was a mass of leaping foam and flying spray, and far away, to the horizon, white-topped waves rolled endlessly. That day she did not even ride out, but contented herself with watching the sea and the storm from the tower. After lunch she went to her tower again, and again after tea. The storm was now furious. She made up her mind that after dinner she would ride down and see its happenings close at hand. When she had finished dinner, she went to her room to dress for her ride. The rush and the roar of the storm were in her ears, and she was in wild, tumultuous spirits. All her youth seemed to sweep back on her, or perhaps it was that the sickness of the last 2 years was swept away. Somewhere deep down in Stephen's heart, below her intention or even her consciousness, was a desire to be her old self, if only for an hour, and to this end externals were of help. Without weighing the matter in her mind and acting entirely on impulse, she told her maid to get the red habit she had not worn for years. When she was dressed, she sent round to have out her white Arab. While it was getting ready, she went once more to the tower to see the storm effect in the darkening twilight. As she looked, her heart for an instant stood still. Halfway to the horizon, a great ship, ablaze in the bows, was driving through the waves with all her speed. She was heading towards the little port, beyond which the shallows sent up a moving wall of white spray. Stephen tore down the turret stair and gave hurried directions to have beds prepared in a number of rooms, fires everywhere, and plenty of provisions. She also ordered that carriages should be sent at once to the fishing port with clothing and restoratives. There would, she felt, be need for such help before a time measured by minutes should have passed, and as some of her servants were as yet strange to her ways, she did not leave anything to chance. One carriage was to go for the doctor, who lived at Noir, the village over the hill. Whence nothing could be seen of what was happening, she knew that others within sight of hailing would be already on their way. Work was afoot, and had she time, or thought of it, she would have chosen a more sedate garb. But in the excitement no thought of herself came to her. In a few seconds she was in the saddle, tearing at full speed down the road that led to the port. The wind was blowing so strongly in her face that only in the lulls could she hear the hoof-strokes of the groom's horse galloping behind her. At first, the height of the road allowed her to see the ship and the port towards which she was making, but presently the road dipped, and the curving of the hill shut both from her sight. It was only when she came close that she could see either again. Now the great ship was close at hand. The flames had gained terribly, and it was a race for life or death. There was no time to do more than run her aground if life was to be saved at all. The captain, who in the gaps of the smoke could be seen upon the bridge, knew his work well. As he came near the shoal, he ran a little north and then turned sharply so as to throw the boat's head to the south of the shoal. Thus the wind would drive fire and smoke forward and leave the after part of the vessel free for a time. The shock of her striking the sand was terrific, though the tinkle of the bell borne in on the gale showed that the engines had been slowed down. The funnels were shaken down, and the masts broke off, falling forward. A wild shriek from 100 throats cleft the roaring of wind and wave. The mast fell, the foremast with all its cumbering top hamper on the bridge, which was in an instant blotted out of existence, together with the little band of gallant men who stood on it, true to their last duty. As the wind took the smoke south, a man was seen to climb on the wreck of the mast aft and make fast the end of a great coil of rope which he carried. He was a huge man with a full dark beard. 2 sailors, working with furious haste, helped him with the rope. The waves kept raising their ship a little, each time bumping her on the sand with a shock. The people on deck held frantically to the wreckage around them. Then the bearded man, stripping to his waist and cutting off his trousers above the knee, fastened an end of the rope round his waist. The sailors stood ready, one behind the other, to pay it out. As a great wave rolled under the ship, he threw himself into the sea. In the meantime, the Coast Guard had fixed Board of Trade rocket apparatus, and in a few seconds the prolonged roar of a rocket was heard. It flew straight towards the ship, rising at a high angle so as to fall beyond it, but the force of the wind took it up as it rose, and the gale increased so that it rose nearly vertically, and in this position the wind threw it south of its objective and short of it. Another rocket was got ready at once, and blue lights were burning so that the course of the venturous swimmer might be noted. He swam strongly, but the great weight of the rope behind kept pulling him back, and the southern trend of the tide current and the force of the wind kept dragging him from the pier. Within the bar the waves were much less than without, but they were still so unruly that no boat in the harbour, which was not a lifeboat station, could venture out. Indeed, in the teeth of the storm, it would have been a physical impossibility to have driven one seaward. As the gathered crowd saw Stephen approach, they made way for her. She had left her horse with the groom, and, despite the drenching spray, fought away against the wind out of the pier. As in the glare of the blue light, which brought many things into harsh, unnatural perspective, she caught sight of the set face of the swimmer, rising and falling with the waves. Her heart leaped. This was indeed a man, a brave man, and all the woman in her went out to him, for him and to aid him and his work. She would have given everything, done everything, and in her heart, which beat in an ecstasy of anxiety, she prayed with that desperate conviction of hope which comes in such moments of exaltation. But it soon became apparent that no landing could be effected. The force of the current and the wind were taking the man too far southward for him ever to win a way back. Then one of the coastguards took the lead-topped cane, which they use for throwing practice, and, after carefully coiling the line, attached it so that it would run free, managed, with desperate effort, to fling it far out. The swimmer, to whom it fell close, fought towards it frantically, and as the cord began to run through the water, managed to grasp it. A wild cheer rose from the shore and the ship. A stout line was fastened to the shore end of the cord, and the swimmer drew it out to him. He bent it on the rope, which trailed behind him. Then, seeing that he was himself a drag on it, with the knife which he drew from a sheath at the back of his waist, he cut himself free. One of the coastguards on the pier, helped by a host of willing hands, began drawing the end of the rope on shore. The swimmer still held the line thrown to him, and several men on the pier began to draw on it. Unhappily, the thin cord broke under the strain, and within a few seconds the swimmer had drifted out of possible help. Seeing that only wild rocks lay south of the sea wall, and that on them seas beat furiously, he turned and made out for sea. In the light beyond the glare, he could see vaguely the shore bending away to the west in a deep curve of unbroken white leaping foam. There was no hope of landing there. To the south was the headland, perhaps 2 miles away, as the crow flies. Here was the only chance for him. If he could round the headland, he might find shelter beyond, or somewhere along the farther shore some opening might present itself. Whilst the light from the blue fires still reached him, he turned and made for the headland. In the meantime, on ship and on shore, men worked desperately. Before long, the end of the hawser was carried round on the high cliff, and pulled as taut as the force at hand could manage, and made fast. Soon endless ropes were bringing in passengers and crew as fast as place could be found for them, It became simply a race for time. If the fire working against the wind did not reach the hawser, and if the ship lasted the furious bumping on the sandbank which threatened to shake her to pieces, each moment, all on board, might yet be saved. Stephen's concern was now for the swimmer alone. Such a gallant soul should not perish without help, if help could be on this side of heaven. She asked the harbour-master, an old fisherman who knew every inch of the coast for miles, if anything could be done. He shook his head sadly, and he answered, "I fear no, my lady. The lifeboat from Grandport is up north. No boat from here could get outside the harbour. There's never a spot in the bay where he could land, even in a less troubled sea than this. With a wind ashore, there's no hope for ship or man here that cannot round the point. And a stranger is no like to do that." "Why not?" she asked breathlessly. "Because, my lady, there's a wheen o' sunken rocks beyond the head. No one that didn't know would ever think to keep out beyond them, for the cliff itself goes down, sheer. He's a gallant soul, Yannon. It's a sore pity he's going to his death. But it must be. God can save him if he wishes, but I fear none other." Even as he spoke, rose to Stephen's mind a memory of an old churchyard with great trees and the scent of many flowers, and a child's voice that sounded harsh through the monotonous hum of bees. To be God, and able to do things. Oh, to be God, if but an hour, and able to do things, to do anything, to help a brave man. A wild prayer surged up in the girl's heart. "Oh God, give me this man's life. Give it to me to atone for the other I destroyed. Let me but help him, and do with me as thou wilt." The passion of prayer seemed to help her, and her brain cleared. Surely something could be done. She would do what she could, but first she must understand the situation. She turned again to the old harbour-master. How long would it take him to reach headland if he can swim so far? The answer came with a settled conviction, bearing hope with it. "The wind and tide are with him, and he's a strong swimmer. Perhaps half an hour will take him there. He's all right in himself. He can swim it, sure. But alack, it's when he gets there his trouble will be, when none can warn him. Look how the waves are lashing the cliff, and mark the white water beyond. What voice can sound him out in those deeps? How could he see if even one were there to warn?" Here was a hope at any rate. Light and sound were the factors of safety. Some good might be effected if she could get a trumpet, and there were trumpets in the rocket cart. Light could be had, must be had, if all the fences round the headland had been gathered for a bonfire. There was not a moment to be lost. She ran to the rocket cart and got a trumpet from the man in charge. Then she ran to where she had left her horse. She had plenty of escort, for by this time many gentlemen had arrived on horseback from outlying distances, and all offered their services. She thanked them and said, "You may be useful here. When all these are ashore, send on the rocket cart and come yourself to the headland as quick as you can. Tell the coastguards that all those saved are to be taken to the castle. In the rocket cart, bring pitch and tar and oil and anything that will flame. Stay," she cried to the chief boatman. "Give me some blue lights." His answer chilled her. "I'm sorry, my lady, but they're all used. There are the last of them burning now. We have burned them ever since that man began to swim ashore." "Then hurry on the rocket cart," she said. as she sprang to the saddle and swept out on the rough track that ran by the cliffs, following in bold curves the windings of the shore. The white Arab seemed to know that his speed was making for life. As he swept along, far outdistancing the groom, Stephen's heart went out in silent words, which seemed to keep time to the gallop. Oh, to be God, and to be able to do things. Give me this man's life. Oh God, give me this man's life, to atone for that noble one which I destroyed. Faster and faster over rough road, cattle track, and grassy sward, over rising and falling ground, now and again so close to the edge of the high cliff that the spume swept up the gullies in the rocks like a snowstorm. The white Arab swept round the curve of the bay and came out on the high headland where stood the fisher's house. On the very brink of the cliff, all the fisher folk, men, women, and children, stood looking at the far-off burning ship, from which the flames rose in leaping columns. So intent were all on the cliff that they did not notice her coming. As the roar of the wind came from them to her, they could not hear her voice when she spoke from a distance. She had drawn quite close, having dismounted and hung her rein over the post of the garden paling, when one of the children saw her and cried out, "The lady! The lady! And she's all in red." The men were so intent on something that they did not seem to hear. They were peering out to the north and were arguing in dumb show as though on something regarding which they did not agree. She drew closer and, touching the old fisherman on the shoulder, called out at his ear. "What is it?" he answered, without turning, keeping his eyes fixed. "I say it's a man swimming." "Joe and Garb, hearsay, as it's only a piece of wood, or sea-wack." "But I know I'm right." "That's a man swimming, or my eyes have lost their power." His words carried conviction. The seed of hope in her beating heart grew on the instant into certainty. "It is a man. I saw him swim off towards here when he had taken the rope on shore. Do not turn round. Keep your eyes on him, so that you may not lose sight of him in the darkness." The old man chuckled. "This darkness? There'll be no differ to me between light and dark, but I'll watch him. It's you, my lady. I shan't turn round to do my reverence as you tell me to watch. But poor soul, it'll not be for long to watch. The Skyers will have him, sure now." "We can warn him," she said, "when he comes close enough. I have a trumpet here." He shook his head sorrowfully. "My lady, what trumpet could sound against that storm, and from this height?" Stephen's heart sank, but there was still hope. If the swimmer's ears could not be reached, his eyes might. Eagerly she looked back for the coming of the rocket cart. Far off across the deep bay she could see its lamp sway as it passed over the rough ground. But alas, it would never arrive in time. With a note of despair in her voice, she asked, "How long before he reaches the rocks?" Still without turning, the old man answered, "At the rate he's going, he will be in sweep of the current through the rocks within 3 minutes. If he's to be saved, he must turn seaward. The stream grips him." "Would there be time to build a bonfire?" No, my lady. The wood couldn't catch in time." For an instant a black film of despair seemed to fall on her. The surging of the blood in her head made her dizzy, and once again the prayer of the old memory rang in her brain. Oh, to be God and able to do things! On the instant an inspiration flashed through her. She, too, could do things in a humble way. She could do something at any rate. If there was no time to build a fire, there was a fire already built. The house would burn. The 2 feet deep of old thatch, held down with nets and battened with wreck timber, would flare like a beacon. Forthwith she spoke. "Good people, this noble man, who has saved a whole shipload of others, must not die without an effort. There must be light, so that he can see our warning to pass beyond the rocks. The only light can be from the house. I buy it of you. It is mine, but I shall pay you for it and build you such another as you never thought of. But it must be fired at once. You have 1 minute to clear out all you want. In, quick, and take all you can. Quick, quick, for God's sake. It is for a brave man's life." The men and women, without a word, rushed into the house. They, too, knew the danger, and the only hope there was for a life. The assurance of the Countess took the sting from the present loss. Before the minute, which she timed watch in hand, was over, all came forth, bearing armloads of their lares and penates. Then one of the younger men ran in again and out, bearing a flaming stick from the fire. Stephen nodded. He held it to the northern edge of the thatch. The straw caught in a flash, and the flame ran up the slope and along the edge of the roof like a quick match. The squeaking of many rats was heard, and their brown bodies streamed over the roof. Before another minute had passed, a great mass of flame towered into the sky and shed a red light far out over the waste of sea. It lit up the wilderness of white water where the sea churned savagely amongst the sunken rocks, and it lit, too, the white face of a swimmer, now nearly spent, who, rising and falling with each wave, drifted in the sea, whose current bore him on towards the fatal rocks. Chapter 32. To be God and able to do things. When the swimmer saw the light, he looked up. Even at the distance, they could see the lift of his face, but he did not seem to realize that there was any intention in the lighting, or that it was created for his benefit. He was manifestly spent with his tremendous exertions and with his long, heavy swim in the turbulent sea. Stephen's heart went out to him in a wave of infinite pity. She tried to use the trumpet, but simple as it is, a trumpet needs skill, or at least practice, in its use. She could not make an unintelligible sound, and not much even of that. One of the young men said, "Let me try it, my lady." She handed him the trumpet, and he in turn used it with a will. But it was of no avail. Even the strong lungs and lusty manhood availed nothing in the teeth of that furious gale. The roof and the whole house was now well alight, and the flame roared and leapt. Stephen began to make gestures, bidding the swimmer, in case he might see her and understand, move round the rocks. But he made no change in his direction, and was fast approaching a point in the tide race whence to avoid the sunken rocks would be an impossibility. The old whaler, accustomed to use all his wits in times of difficulty, said suddenly, "How can he understand when we're all between him and the light? We are only black shadows to him. All he can see are waving arms." His sons caught his meaning, and were already dashing towards the burning house. They came back with piles of blazing wood and threw them down on the very edge of the cliff, brought more and piled them up, flinging heaps of straw